Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of July in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Christine Lagarde says the ECB needs more time to weigh the risk of inflation uncertainties.
The US Supreme Court rules Trump has some immunity from prosecution, with a pre-election trial now increasingly unlikely.
Plus, as new data shows employers doubling down on the importance of degrees, Britain's famed universities teeter on a financial cliff. We have a special report.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Christine Lagarde says the European Central Bank doesn't yet have sufficient evidence the threat of inflation has passed. The ECB president's comments suggest a preference for keeping rates on hold at this month's meeting. Speaking at the central bank's annual retreat in Sintra in Portugal, Lagarde said the robust jobs market means there is time to assess incoming data.
We are still facing several uncertainties regarding future inflation, especially in terms of how the nexus of profits, wages and productivity will evolve, and whether the economy will be hit by new supply-side shocks. And it will take time for us to gather sufficient data to be certain that the risks of above-target inflation have passed.
Christine Lagarde's comments come ahead of new Eurozone inflation data set to be released at 10 a.m. London time today.
President Macron's centrist alliance and the left-wing New Popular Front are considering pulling candidates from the French legislative election in a bid to stop the far right. The National Rally and its allies came top in the first round of voting with just over 33% of the vote. An outright majority for Marine Le Pen's party or a hung parliament are now the most likely outcomes. Speaking to Bloomberg, Sebastian Redler, head of European equity strategy at Bank of America Global Research, says that markets aren't convinced by either possibility.
It's hard to argue that you got a good outcome. Maybe you block a majority by the hard right, but in the best case scenario, you get a hung parliament that effectively means very little decision making, no ability to deal with a very wide budget deficit, and also the European integration story effectively put on hold.
Bank of America's Sebastian Redler there on Bloomberg Television. Now, despite an early rally, gains on French stocks and the euro pared back yesterday as investors' doubts returned. A second round of French voting is expected to take place on the 7th of July.
Inflation in UK shops has fallen to nearly zero. Data from the British Retail Consortium shows prices in June were 0.2% higher than last year. That's the slowest rise since 2021. It's the latest sign of easing price pressures as markets expect the Bank of England to cut interest rates as early as August. Now, there is a growing concern about the precarious finances of UK universities hit by inflation, frozen fees and a drop in international students. David Willetts, the former universities minister who oversaw the last big fee increase in 2012, has told Bloomberg that the next government needs to start increasing fees in line with inflation every year. Willetts says although some individual universities are in very tough circumstances, he doesn't expect widespread university bankruptcies.
The sector is certainly under pressure. Overall, it is still the case that they've got reasonable financial reserves, though those are diminishing. There are some special cases. There are some universities that people are looking at nervously that may be on the edge. Yes, so there are some specific risks plus a general financial pressure.
Lord Willetts speaking to us for a special podcast on whether Britain's university funding model is broken. While Keir Starmer's Labour Party has promised crisis-hit universities a, quote, secure future, the party's manifesto offers no details on how that might be financed. The ruling Conservatives have made no new commitments for UK universities in their policy platform under Rishi Sunak. The US Supreme Court has ruled Donald Trump is immune from some criminal charges. The decision is a major blow to prosecutors hoping to take the former president to trial before the November election. Chicago-Kent College of Law professor Harold Krent explains the court's thinking on if US presidents can be charged for crimes.
The court split the baby in a sense by saying that there was going to be absolute immunity for some kind of presidential acts, those acts that fall within the core of his executive powers. And for other acts, it's presumptive immunity, which means that the lower court will have to go through the indictment and the trial and sort of separate out all the acts.
Professor Harold Krent adds the decision means major delays to the 3 ongoing criminal cases against the former president. Trump was convicted in New York State Court on the 30th of May for falsifying business records to conceal a hush money payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election.
Joe Biden, meanwhile, has called on voters to render a judgment on Donald Trump after the ruling. The president told the nation the US Supreme Court has undone more than 200 years of American law.
It's a terrible disservice to the people of this nation. So now the American people have to do what the courts should have been willing to do, but will not. The American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior.
Biden's address comes as his own party are considering formally nominating him early. Bloomberg has learned that key Democrats are weighing the move to try to stamp down on conversations about replacing Biden after a disastrous debate performance. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about our special report on the challenges facing UK universities. We'll also hear about what ECB policymakers have been saying at their annual central banking forum in Sintra. But another story also caught our eye this morning. You've heard of shrinkflation? Now get ready for upflation.
So this is a strategy that consumer goods companies are employing to try and keep shoppers spending as their wallets have been squeezed by the cost of living crisis in many parts of the world. So the result of this, from a company point of view, is that they're seeing people buying fewer things at higher prices. So to try and win those people back and get them to spend more, companies have come up with this new tactic, become known as upflation, which is to try and create new uses for things that consumers have decided they no longer need as much of, and then charging them more for it. So, one example, the all-over body deodorant from Procter & Gamble. Right. It's double the cost of a standard stick of deodorant. Most people, according to one of the experts quoted in this piece by our colleagues, don't need it, but it is something that companies are now marketing to consumers. Same goes for razors that you use on different parts of your body. So people are marketing those in different ways and charging more for them as well. For the moment, this does seem to be a mostly American phenomenon. Unilever, of course, a London-based company, did introduce one of these all-over body deodorants, but they're only marketing it in the US at the moment. In China, people are trying to get more for their money by gravitating to products that have multiple benefits. For example, the 3-minute miracle conditioner for damaged hair. That's one of the products as well. So it's a new strategy consumer goods companies are trying to take to get people to keep spending on a product by essentially just marketing it in a different way.
So hang on, does the body spray replace expensive perfume? Is that the idea?
No, I think it's supposed to be an addition.
In addition
it's
to?
a yes and question, Caroline.
Right, all right. Well, then I'm not sure how much money you save from that. But okay, interesting. I love learning a new word, so I will definitely be using that in future.
There you are. Use it in a sentence.
Yeah. Okay, so from that to the ECB this morning, President Christine Lagarde says that policymakers don't yet have sufficient evidence that inflation threats have actually passed. In her opening speech to the European Central Bank's annual meeting in the Portuguese town of Sintra, Lagarde didn't mention the political upheaval in France that has so roiled markets. Our Euro area economy reporter Alex Webber joins us now from Sintra for more. Good morning, Alex.
Morning.
So Lagarde has set quite a cautious tone, it would seem, at this ECB forum, saying that it's too soon to claim victory over inflation. Is that the prevailing view, do you think, of the policymakers who are gathered there?
Yes, indeed. It seems so. We've heard very little recently from officials in terms of what might happen next. They've really struck a cautious tone because while inflation has indeed slowed closer toward the 2% target, there are still some bits that are cause for concern. And yes, the ECB has a forecast that shows 2% inflation next year. But officials really want to see that the economy does indeed develop along those lines. And that's why they're taking this step by step. Because the labor market is so strong, there's not really a risk that the economy is derailing. So they have the luxury of being able to take this rather slowly. Also, they don't want to get too far away from other central banks, maybe. And therefore, it seems indeed like July is not going to be an option for another cut.
Alex, this gathering in Sintra always really interesting because it's a chance to see central bankers relaxing while also working, and these are high-level policy discussions too. I do wonder in the conversations that are happening there, though, how much are people talking about the situation in France, the political turmoil there, which has been having an impact on markets?
Yeah, we've been asking officials, of course. It is an important thing for the ECB to consider. France is the second biggest Eurozone economy. That said, central bankers are usually quite hesitant to talk about politics in the Eurozone, especially they don't want to talk about individual countries, rather talk about the impact on the aggregate economy. We haven't seen too much of that yet. Of course, there's been this fallout on financial markets and investors being quite nervous. Their officials have said quite clearly that they don't see a need for concern at the moment. So there's been speculation that the ECB might have to activate its crisis tool, with which it could sort of calm investors and rein in bond spreads, but that is really not a discussion at the moment. We're far away from that.
OK, that's interesting. Meanwhile, you've also got the latest euro area inflation print, which comes out later today. What's that expected then to add to the view in terms of the rate path ahead?
Yeah, we should see a slight downtick in both the headline and the core inflation. So that should give the ECB a peace of mind. We saw an uptick last month. So that all confirms the view that there is some fluctuation in the inflation path ahead, but that the general trend is intact. And as long as that is intact, then officials will be quite confident. That said, at the moment, it's a lot about the details. So we're looking at services inflation, which is still running at around twice the ECB's 2% target. So that's where people are going to look closely to see whether there's any slowdown to be seen there.
Alex, I know this for a job like yours where you're talking to central bankers all the time, this is a different environment to be following them around kind of fairy tale castles in the Portuguese hills. What else are you keen to learn from those policymakers when you speak to them during this event?
So, this is a really a sort of academic event, an opportunity to dive into topics on a more academic basis. And this is really much about sort of understanding what really happened over the last 2 to 3 years, because this has been such an unusual interest rate cycle. There's going to be a really interesting paper to be discussed this morning about the drivers of the inflation shock, whether it was really driven by supply or whether it was demand. That's a really controversial issue, actually. And then we also have a panel on geopolitics, which is a really interesting theme and didn't used to be this prominent in the past, but now it's something that central bankers really have to contend with. So these are really interesting topics to be followed here.
Yeah, OK, very interesting. Alex, thank you so much for being with us then from Sintra this morning, our Euro area economy reporter, Alex Webb.
We're going to turn now, though, to the situation facing UK universities. An existential crisis. Stagnant fees and inflation are squeezing higher education institutions. The sector is also losing valuable international students, and yet government and business are touting it as key to the UK economy. Caroline, you have a special podcast out today looking at this subject, whether the UK's universities' funding model is broken.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of areas in the UK that perhaps require overhaul, but education may be key. It's seen as indispensable in terms of skills and therefore building the economic growth that the UK really needs. Fees have been stagnant, though. £9,250 is what undergraduates have to pay per year in the UK, domestic ones at least. That figure has not moved since 2017. So inflation has made it worth so much less than it was only a few years ago. There's also been this dramatic decline in foreign students who pay much higher fees after the Conservative government clamped down on visas. So the Office for Students has warned that 40% of England's universities are expected to run budget deficits this year, and therefore they need to do more work to secure their long-term sustainability. So I put together this podcast interviewing a whole host of players in higher education, along with my colleague Helen Chandler-Wild, who's been researching this too. And I've called
the podcast University Challenge because because of the challenges that the next government is going to face on higher education.
Well, thinking about the next government, what is in the manifestos for universities? Is there money on the way?
No new money. The manifestos really promise very little. Labour outlines a larger role for institutions in terms of skills training, promising them a, quote, secure future. They do say that the sector is crisis hit, but they actually don't talk about any new money. They have scrapped and moved away from the 2019 idea of the Labour Party committing to scrapping all tuition fees. They don't want to do that. The Conservative Party's made no new commitments in terms of universities. And the CEO of Universities UK has made some statements saying that the Labour Party needs swift action, not just a kind of review of higher education that could take months. So I've been speaking to David Willetts, who was the former Universities Minister, who oversaw the switch to £9,000 tuition fees. He says, look, you need those fees. You know, they are much protested against. He regrets not having indexed the fees to inflation. He doesn't expect a large number of UK universities to go bankrupt. He told me that the next government will have to do a major overhaul, though.
As an absolute minimum, we need to start increasing the fees in line with inflation year after year. And of course, once again, getting across, this isn't money that students have to pay up front. This is a basis of a graduate repayment scheme. However, I think we probably also do need a step change up from 9,000, and who knows, by 1,000, 2,000 or something. And for that, there needs to be a wider settlement with whichever party is the new government.
So that's David Willetts, former Universities Minister, now President of the Resolution Foundation. Caroline, how worried are universities about their future?
They are very worried. There's been a real chorus. It's very notable, the number of Vice-Chancellors who've talked about this, but they're also adapting. So I spoke to Professor Frances Corner, who's the Warden of Goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London. She says that university fees have always been a political hot potato going back to Nick Clegg. I mean, remember also the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talking very pointedly about clamping down on rip-off degrees. I mean, that sort of language didn't go down very well with the organisations, or universities, that is. Corner says that Goldsmiths has made very difficult and painful changes. They've slashed courses. They've brought in new models, like a 2-year degree, for example. She tells me why she thinks actually the UK funding model has not kept pace.
There's been a sort of political ambivalence, is perhaps one way of describing it. How many people should be in higher education? You know, do we want to have the 50%? I mean, I would argue that we should be moving towards a universal aspect of higher education, you know, because of the knowledge-based economy, because of AI, because of the global impact. The teaching of creative subjects has been undermined in schools. So what you have now are fewer students coming through to study GCSE and A-level. As a consequence, which then has affected the application rate to institutions like Goldsmiths, and has made across the UK the funding of some of the humanities courses really quite perilous.
So that was Professor Corner. She adds that Goldsmith is now as efficient as it can be and that they're on the right track for the next year. All of this, of course, amidst the government and business pushing in recent years for a lot more vocational training. There was something about that in the manifestos, and Rishi Sunak in the past has promised 100,000 new apprenticeships. And yet also out today from Bloomberg, new analysis by my colleague Irina Angel that looks at the Reed recruitment data. And it shows at a time when employment in the UK is ticking lower, it's still university graduates who have got the edge. And so it's going to be a very difficult time, I think, for the next government with little money and all of these pressures to build skills. You know, you've got AI, you've got the need for economic success in the UK. The finances are going to be really quite tricky.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.